We spoke earlier about some of the highlights, and one of the things that jumped out for me was that you talked about companies being successful at creating new digital businesses, at getting into new areas, using digital distribution and so on, but that there are still these big challenges in terms of revenue growth. How do they fix that? How do they...
So that question is like trying to sort of tackle the elephant in the room, right? Because, you know, we talk about advertising growth and then we get right to the difficult bit, which is how do we actually monetize the consumer? So, you know, we all know, we as consumers, we're reading more, we're watching more, we're listening more, we're doing all sorts of things more. But the issue is, what are we actually paying for it? So the challenge, and I think not just in this market, but globally, is around that monetization. You know, there is no, if there was a simple answer to that, I don't think we would actually be sitting here. We would have really have just done it, right? But what we do know is that there are certain things that appear to be kind of core to making it work. And I think that the acknowledgement that it is around the experience and unlocking the value of the experience for the consumer that I think is really important. So if you couple that with making it easy to actually get these people to pay. So, you know, you could, I mean, I'm sure many of us have debated, you know, will people just inherently not pay, right? Or will people pay for something? I am still somewhat naive in believing that people will pay for something, but it's got to be a value. So the question is how do we make something valuable to you that you'll put your hand in your pocket for? Increasingly, I think that's around the experience. And you know, we talk a lot about innovation currently. Innovation is kind of the watchword. To me, one of the areas of absolute innovation is around experiential innovation. So how do we innovate in making you, as a consumer, get a better experience and therefore put your hand in your wallet?
And be willing to pay.
And be willing to pay, right? And give you a way that's paying that's convenient to you. So whether it's sort of, you know, all-you-can-eat access type route, whether it's micropayments, you know, we have to also acknowledge that at different stages in our lives, we're probably going to prefer different types of payment, you know, methods. When you got very little money, you're prepared to go and engage in micropayments because you know what, it's not so painful, right? But if you've got more money, then probably you're more into convenience and you just want, I just want to pay once and just stream it to me or whatever. And I think it's around that combination of flexible pricing, flexible payment plans, and you know, all hooked around an added value experience.
Do you think consumers have gotten, or the technology has made consumers a bit more lazy? That they don't have to go to the store anymore to buy their CD or, you know?
Well, it might have made you more lazy because you used to go to the store. The question is, what about the consumer who never thought of going to the store in the first place, right? So I think there's a, you know, we have to acknowledge, and going back to, you know, we use this term about digital natives and digital migrants, but in some ways it's still relevant because behaviours are driven by, you know, to what impact are we, you know, getting over a legacy. So are we becoming more lazy? I don't know. We're definitely times, you know, we're very conscious of time. And so what I think we do want is whatever we want it quick.
Right.
So let's not mess around, right? So, you know, when you log on to something, you know, what's one of the biggest hassles right now is having to have multiple passwords at multiple different levels, right? I just want to log on, for Christ's sake.
When you talk about, Stephanie touched on this, I think that access costs, internet access costs, are pretty still very high to the extent that they're holding back spending on digital content, for example, that consumers might not spend as much as they would if access was cheaper. How long is that going to continue to hold back?
Well, I think,
yeah,
look, I think in some markets actually access is becoming easier. I think, yes, price is always an issue, but I actually think the major thing is actually getting the access and having it working and having it reliable. So I think reliability is a big issue.
And not having to enter lots of passwords.
But reliability around, I mean, you know, a lot of what we talk about is great, but if you go to many parts of the world and you try to do what you want to do, you still can't do it, right? So I think I focus slightly more on the reliability point. In terms of, you know, it is interesting because we debate this every year as to whether we should be calling access, part of entertainment and media spend. I would still argue that if you didn't have great content there, you wouldn't be going there. Okay, you might be going there for communication, accepted. But ultimately, you're going there because there's an awful lot of good stuff there, right? And that's what you're actually paying for, to go to the good stuff. And that's why we call it part of the industry. The question, I suppose, is how do you make the next step so that you've got them to pay for the access, but now you've got to get them to pay for the content.
Right, okay. I guess some of the most engaged consumers who are paying for content, who are right there at sort of coalface, are the super fans you talk about.
Well, super fans are cool. I mean, I'm sure some of the other speakers will probably talk more about super fans than with more authority than I can. But I mean, there are a couple of things about the super fan. First of all, they're passionate. So, one thing a super fan wants is generally wants to get it quicker, right? And, if we think about it, that we will, even as a non-super fan, you're much more prepared to pay for something when it's fresh than when it's 6 months old, right? So a super fan is actually taking advantage, one part of the super fan is taking advantage of that absolute appetite for whatever it is. The second thing is super fans are super vocal, right? So they're super advocates. And what we need these days is to capture the value of those advocates, because one super advocate can have an immediate impact on 100,000 people. And so I think the super fan is an interesting phenomenon, one which I think not just entertainment and media brands, but brands generally are looking to exploit.
Is it a new phenomenon?
Well, the way I just described it, I don't think that sounded that new.
Yeah. I'm thinking about people who buy, get first in line for their iPhone every time there's a new iPhone comes out.
Yeah, so it's not that new.
Yeah. But are companies doing enough to reach them and to... Because they can be a powerful force for them, can't they?
Well, I think that's exactly what we're saying, is that they can be a very powerful force. And, I always try to boil things back down to sort of basics. But, as you said, whether you were first in the queue, whether you queue overnight to get your new iPhone, this has existed. The question is how do we use that to a greater scale? And that's why actually we're highlighting it as a key topic this year, because if we're talking about influence and we're talking about reaching consumers, it's a key part and it's a key thing to leverage. So, and as I say, I'm sure some of the people that are going to be following us will talk about that as well.
What about, I guess, the big sort of shift in the business that I see and that we're writing about pretty constantly, is this notion of access over ownership, that in terms of buying content, buying music or video, or consuming music and video, that people are no longer really willing to buy stuff to own. They want to get access to it, and they'll pay for that access. But they don't want shelves that are bursting with DVDs anymore, or CDs or anything like that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of like a rental versus ownership model. Right. I think that again, it's different content, but different things meet different needs. I mean, I was talking only yesterday about the collectible aspect of content as well. I think there are some people, I mean, if you look at when a music star dies, right? It's amazing how people rush out and buy a physical version of that because they want it as a collectible. Now, are they buying the collectible as are they buying the collectible, or are they buying the music? So I think also what we have to look at is what are we actually talking about in terms of what people want physically. I think that what people definitely get frustrated about is paying for the same thing multiple times. And, I mean, that has happened a lot in the history of the industry, is that actually we've spent money in different geographies, in, a track versus a track off a movie. We've paid for it multiple times. And I think that's a bit of an issue. That people are seeing through that. So
they've got wise to that.
I think they have.
It's a bit of it's not a scam as such, but it's a bit of, getting.
Is that an F2? You wouldn't use that word in one of your
getting. I might do actually.
Would you?
But but getting windowing and getting consumers to pay for the same thing multiple times. I mean, that's
windowing wasn't the same as. I wouldn't quite go that far.
Right.
Just have to keep these guys in touch. But what I would say is I think people are just very are aware of it. And so to answer your original question, yes, I think people are, questioning what they need to physically own. But by the way, you can own it in the cloud. Right. You don't have to put it on a shelf.
So the consumers become more discerning.
Yeah, that's why in New York you have such small apartments, by the way. You were talking to me about that.
Yeah, that's my challenge at the moment. What about sort of, there's a huge international opportunity, isn't there, for in terms of access. I mean, we spoke about companies like Netflix, which have 50 million subscribers and growing.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a model there for other companies, other subsectors within the media industry to borrow from?
Well, it is interesting actually when you look at, if you dissect the numbers, particularly around sort of the consumer spend element, you know, this elephant in the room. The fastest growing, the two best performing sort of elements of that, one are streaming services. I think the OTT streaming, we're looking at, I think, around about 23% compound growth rate. We have music streaming around about 14% compound. So both of those are kind of like doing well. And then another area that's doing well is everything to do with live, right? So if you look at live music events, doing well. Actually, if you look at the movie-going experience, doing well. If you look at trade events, doing well. So it's interesting, we have two kind of like things that are doing okay. Everything to do with an enhanced experience that may well be a physical. By the way, those revenues are never going to be classified digital. Those are physical experiences. And over here, you've got streaming services. And those are the two bright spots right now.
And people are willing to pay for those experiences. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, look, you go and see Lady Gaga. I mean, it's amazing. You know, how much do you have to pay to go and see Lady Gaga? Quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
Well, you would think you were going to listen to music, but clearly you're not, because you're not paying for the music. You're paying for the experience.
And access is has crossed age barriers too, hasn't it? My dad, for example, has a Spotify account. I mean, people are, you know, people who are older are embracing this in a way that. Or maybe my dad's an outlier. I don't know what's.
Yeah, you could argue that was an ageist comment.
Yeah.
And being very PC, you know, you could argue.
Yeah.
Look,
But I mean, it's cross-generational. It's global.
Yeah,
And
that's the key word. It is cross-generational. I think one of the things that we've seen over the past few years is that, you know, you can't make sort of generalizations that it's this generation or that generation, because, you know what? I mean, there is a dynamic that says in some parts of the world where parents are working, right? Grandparents are bringing up the children. The children are learning are very digital, right? So they're teaching their grandparents, and actually the ones in the middle who are the parents who are out working are probably, you know, slightly less digital in their use than the grandparents. You know, so I think it's very cross-generational.
What about, I mean, the emerging market countries we talked about, and the emerging middle, which I know is
I've got one of those.
Yeah. Yes. But this is your. I mean, you think we've been looking at the wrong thing, don't you? With looking at emerging markets, so we're lumping them together in the way that we.
Look, I think it's too. You know, I think the term emerging markets, you know, whether we use emerging, developing, or whatever, fast growing. I kind of like fast growing actually. Emerging middle is not to be confused with emerging markets. Some of it is the same, some of it is different. You know, the thing about emerging middle is the emerging middle class. Right? And that's what we're talking about. And wherever you see sort of strong shifts in demographics, I mean, there's an emerging middle class here in the US, right? You know, if you look at the growing Hispanic population, that's an example. So the issue with the emerging middle is really how do you capture it and how do you monetize it? Because in certain and also, you know, what it means in different markets, it means different things in different markets, right? And it will generate different opportunities based on that. So, you know, you could argue on one hand that the emerging middle doesn't have the legacy, right? So they're not burdened by legacy. So they're becoming very mobile. That's the first thing they really know is their mobile device. And they're being very connected. So you could argue that they haven't got a legacy, they're very mobile, very connected. That's interesting. So they're going to be quite different from someone who has had a legacy, etc. However, you could argue that an emerging middle, if you define that in relation to the Indian market, you know, it comes back to this point as to, you know, initially, the initial aspiration is I want to buy my own newspaper because I've been sharing it. You know, it's one of the reasons why newspapers are doing so well in India. Right. But on the other hand, you know, as soon as they get connected, they move on to something else. So understanding what drives the emerging middle in every market is, I think, critical to unpicking that sort of growth opportunity.
And do you think are US media companies doing enough to capitalize on that?
So do you want me to get through? Yeah, okay. Our US media company, I knew you would ask me that type of question.
We're sitting here in New York. I was one of the.
Yeah, but you're from the FT.
Yeah.
You could said, is your parent company doing? No, okay. Look, I think that one thing I would say is there's very rarely one day of the year when you will get it right, because the world is moving so quickly, right? So I think that US media companies are spending a lot of time doing what we're talking about now, which is really trying to understand the local opportunity. I think the first wave of international expansion, we're probably on to about the fourth wave, made certain mistakes, is that it was an export model. Right. So I'm still a believer, and I can't remember the first time I heard this, but the sort of global brands, local activity. Yeah. I still believe in that. And as someone who basically lives outside of the US and spends all his time traveling, I know that it's around unpicking local opportunities, and it's working with local partners because they're the best people to do it, and it's looking for the vast majority of the world doesn't mind being informed, perhaps in English, but I'll tell you what, they want to have fun in their own language.
And they want relevancy.
And they want relevancy. Yeah. They want their stars. They want So I think it's how do you take all the good stuff that's done by international media companies and localize it.
And there's a side benefit, a pretty big benefit, if you think about filmed entertainment in doing this, right, with piracy, because piracy, if you're producing locally and engaging people locally, it will have a knock-on effect on piracy. Someone who runs a big, large trade association in Asia, I mean, it has been true for a long time that to get to the attention of regulators in different markets, you've got to point to the damage that's occurring in their market. Right.
They really don't care about the damage it's doing. It may have some impact on USTR negotiations, Yeah. But I'll tell you what, if there's a real impact in their market and you can demonstrate the loss in their market to their industry or to their retailers or to something, then you can begin to have a better conversation. So yes, the more you localize and the more you get local skin in the game, the better that conversation is going to happen.
And with movie studios, are they aware of this? I mean, I know that they...
Totally.
Right.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, yes, but I think that, and this has improved so much in the last 3 years, but one of the initial, certainly 3 or 4 years ago, I would say the number one thing I heard around piracy was, well, if you make it available to me, I don't have to pirate it, because one of the drivers of piracy it wasn't available. Now that has been addressed. It's not entirely addressed, but it's much closer to being addressed. So that was an issue. Yeah, local production, local partners certainly help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So China is obviously driving things in film entertainment. That's on course, I think, to overtake the US within the next 10 years or so, isn't that right?
Well, it certainly will become the second largest market, film market. And it is the second largest market.
It will become the second largest TV market by 2018, you say in the report.
Yeah, and by the way, that's an interesting one, because actually TV is losing share. Right. So if you look at total ad share, and I mean, Steph was talking about the 33% global internet share, right? In China by 2018, we're looking at 55. Right. So, while everything is growing in China, while most sectors are continuing to do relatively well, that 1 in every $2 by 2018, actually by 2070. So that's a big thing. I think, China, I've always had strong views about where I live. I think we have seen, we're seeing slightly more progress there than we have before. That doesn't mean that it's easy, but certainly the third plenum, which was about 6 to 9 months ago, made some more encouraging noises around, the third plenum was basically talking about certain industries that China wants to develop. Mm. One of them translates as entertainment and culture, is one of them. And I think they're very conscious of the fact that they need to bolster their own sectors. And so that is a priority. Now, those are words, but generally speaking, I think that's also a positive development, actually, for all of us that try to do business there.
Do they want to do this in a closed way, or are they willing to engage with international companies?
So the proof of the pudding we'll still got to see what it is, right? But I think there is more of an awareness, in particular, of the need to develop their own industries to be competitive, in particular with what's happening on the internet, right? Because when you've got 55% of ads going on the internet, it means the traditional sector actually isn't performing as well. So I think one of the opportunities is around transformation of the existing sector to make the existing sector more competitive, and that does provide actually an opportunity for others who can help do that, including, I hope, us.
Right.
He says.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, they've got this mushrooming sector in electronic access, video games, and micropayments.
Yep.
And some very, very large companies that are starting to throw their weight around internationally too, which we probably can't talk about because they're probably clients.
They are.
But is there if you're an international company looking at China, are you locked out or are you trying to find a way in? What would your
So
advice be
obviously,
doing?
if someone pays me a lot of money, I'm always happy to help them do that.
Right.
But you know, by way of a bit of a freemium, I guess I got to throw something out there, right? So I mean, those companies that you talk about, which by the way are becoming, I think, true online conglomerates and becoming very, very powerful. They're very interesting to watch because you know, they're moving into all sorts of aspects of the economy. They're looking at financial services. They're looking at obviously some of them come from e-commerce and then look at film. You know, so they're all very active. I think though the point that I would say is that and you mentioned the importance of gaming. Gaming is a huge pastime in China. It plays very well to the sort of the mobile misbehavior that we're becoming. And I did say misbehavior. You can ask me about that later. Mobile gaming is a huge area of interest right now. The venture capital community are, you know, running after every sort of mobile gaming developer that there is. Very hot sector. You know, it plays very well to, you know, what is available, and it plays well to the mobile sort of penetrations that we see in China. So a lot going on. The freemium that I referred to, I mean, I guess it's still the, you know, one thing I would say is that it is still very challenging, okay? But the most successful operations are those that find ultimately the right person to do business with. And you are finding, you know, even compared with 10, 15 years ago, a greater degree of, I think, you know, experienced entrepreneurs who are very well connected that can help.
Right.
So hugely difficult. It still comes down to the right local partner. But it was encouraging to see some positive words coming out of the third plenum 6-9 months ago.
Right. And I guess last year or the year before, I can't remember when it was exactly, but there was the change to the quota in terms of international films. It eased. Which was a huge story in Hollywood. I mean, this.
It was a huge story in China as well. And if you look at the box office numbers that have been coming out over the last time, you look at success of X-Men, for example. Right. You know, huge impact. And I think that I mean, we all hope that will ease further. But in the meantime, you know, co-production activity is increasing significantly.
And this is where the growth is, right? I mean, I guess in a box office, you know, the domestic box office here is pretty flat or isn't growing much at all, and all the growth is in markets like China.
Plays the emerging middle. Right, it does play to the emerging middle because, you know, it's a bit like Steph used the example of, you know, a magazine. Magazine arguably was always a sort of semi-luxurious purchase, right? Well, going to the movies is similar, but as soon as you've got some disposable income and you look at the disposable income numbers and you give them the screens. So one of the issues has just literally been the build out of screens. So, you know, if you look at the development of tier 3, tier 4 cities and you look at, you know, the build out of digital screens, you know, when you build screens and you've got an emerging middle, they will come. And
media is something that this middle class will, when it has discretionary income, this is one of the first things.
Traditionally, our industry is one of the ones that benefits most.
Right.
And by the way, if you add the fact that these people have got discretionary income, so they're really attractive to brands as well, and then the advertisers pile in as well, and then hey presto, you know, you've got an interesting development. Not all advertisers, but.
and subject close to my heart, this emerging middle is also, well, hopefully leading the turnaround in the newspaper industry, right? I like the fact that on your chart that the newspaper was right at the bottom with the losses almost off the chart.
That was in the US.
Yeah, it was in the, yeah. But globally, it's a better picture, isn't it?
Globally, I mean, to be fair, globally it has been a better picture for a while. You know, it's not just India. I mean, you know, there are other markets that do remarkably, you know, robust around the world. I think, is the emerging middle helping? Yes, the emerging middle is helping. Mm-hmm. I do think the question really will be around, you know, for those markets where newspapers have been something that people aspire to read, it will help. But there are markets where a newspaper is not well positioned, and will they suddenly become well positioned? Probably not.
But in India, for example, you meant, I think...
Oh yeah, I mean, the classic example, which I think you must have stolen from me at some point. But you know, hey, we live in a boundary. Yeah, maybe. But you know, the aspiration, you could argue, you know, the aspiration of where you shared a newspaper, right, and your aspiration is to own your own. That is helping, for sure. You know, it always amazes me, you know, when we talk about 10, 11% sort of growth rates in newspapers in India, I sort of, if I haven't been there for sort of 3 or 4 months, I kind of think, are we right? And then I go there and I go, oh yeah, we're right.
You're also talking points on the chart behind. You talk about tax morality. Can you talk us through that, how that...
yeah, all the ones.
An issue. Well, it's interesting. How, you know, an issue that could affect some of the. You know, these are high growth companies doing lots of innovative things that are running into some trouble in some markets.
Yeah, and they are. And I think, you know, obviously it's an issue that needs to be addressed because governments are really interested in it. I mean, governments are after their fair share, right? That's the way they would look at it. Governments are after our fair share. The problem, I think, that sometimes with the headlines around a debate is people fail to realise that actually many organisations are actually paying significant amounts of tax in a number of territories. Right. It may not necessarily be tax on profits, but, you know, whether it's contributing through, you know, there's lots of other taxes. I mean, good grief, you go to Brazil, there's about hundreds of taxes, right? So I think you have to look at not necessarily, you know, one tax alone. Mm-hmm. You actually have to look at what a corporation contributes through a variety of taxes, both direct and indirect, through the employment and hence the tax revenues from them. I mean, it's a big argument. The issue that I think we have to be very aware of is that you know, governments are much more sensitive to it, and managing the PR of that, I think, is actually a huge part of the challenge. I
mean, in the UK, there have been boycotts, demonstrations. You know, I guess we shouldn't name the companies, but there are several that are in the firing line, aren't there?
Yes.
And there can be a big knock to a reputation and to public image.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, if we think of the value of media brands in particular, media brands have a huge value, mm-hmm. And if they get tarnished in any way, then that has an immediate impact. Mm-hmm. So I do think, to be fair to many organisations, it's also a matter of the PR around some of this, right? Because the reality isn't always what media focuses on.
Right. Okay. What about? I mean, just going kind of back to where we started about connected consumers.
Yeah.
And whether or not media companies are doing enough to reach and engage with them. I mean, they talk about them a lot, and they're all out there. But are they doing enough to service their needs and to make money out of them?
Well, you know, if we ask this room as consumers whether they think that media brands are doing enough to connect with them. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'll tell you what, see that. How many think as consumers, not as executives in the industry, as consumers, are organisations, media companies doing enough to connect with you and to really know you and understand you? How many would say yes? There you go. Need I say more?
Damning silence.
Well, a damning silence, but actually I think if there was a passionate advocate, so I think it's probably kind of like morning effect, but it's an interesting thing because as consumers, we probably know the answer. But then the issue is, how do we translate from what we know from our own behaviors and from the behaviors of our sons and daughters, and then say, well, how do we translate that into what we actually have to do?
Mm-hmm. So they might actually know how to do it. I mean, that's...
Well, there are issues. It's not easy, right?
Right, right. Do we have any questions for Marcel from the audience? Are we, or on any of the things that we've raised? I wonder. Here we are, over here.
Can I make a quick input?
Yeah.
Yes, Oscar.
I'm from Johannesburg in South Africa, and that's the first advert. So if you're looking to come to the continent,
Yeah, by the way, that's in the up-and-coming segment, fast-growing, very good newspaper market, very good radio market.
yeah, I'm putting my hand up to be a partner. Lots of very fast-growing markets on the continent.
Yeah.
Just an interesting thing that started to happen on the continent. So after colonization, if you had to look at most of the media assets across Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, they were English. Right? I'm talking about the English colonized markets. And those were the number one assets, whether they were in print or television or newspapers. The big change about 10 years ago was, if you had to go in now, indigenous language, so native languages, are the ones that just took over. So there was this post-colonial effect, and then it just changed. So even in South Africa, all of the English newspapers are in a terminal decline. But the ones that have grown are 5 years ago, and it sounds logical, but it took so long for media companies, the point you were making earlier, how responsive are they to their consumers? People at the executive level think English. And the moment they started to do, for example, a Zulu language newspaper, that just blew up. It was just huge. And that's sustaining itself. So that's an interesting phenomenon, I think, across the continent.
Yeah.
We go into Kenya, it's indigenous language, #1 radio station, and so on.
And by the way, the same thing applies even in India, because within India, obviously, you've got different, depending on where you are, you've got different dialects. And actually, one of the big opportunities in print is taking a Hindi version and making it into, so absolutely the same in India as well.
Well, and other places too, right? I mean, it's,
Yeah.
So this sort of thinking globally but acting locally is sort of a mantra. Any other? Go ahead. Oh, here.
Hi, I'm David Cox from The Economist, and I just wanted to reference the first slide that was put up this morning, and particularly the magazine sector, which was right down at the bottom of that slide.
Next to newspapers.
Yes, next to newspapers, although I see newspapers was actually doing a bit better. I'm just interested to sort of get your perceptions on whether you're actually getting more pessimistic about the magazine sector and its decline and the shift from advertising to digital and into other medium, or whether in fact it's the same sort of pattern that you saw last year in this survey.
That's a good question. The changes are modest. So personally, and I'm going to say, it's not just, so there's the magazine sector in totality, and then there are magazines. And I think that the magazine sector in totality isn't overall improving. But that doesn't mean that magazines aren't improving. So, I do think that for some magazines, the tablet has, as you well know, actually been a driver of growth, right? I think if you look at, so I think that's been good in some markets. I think if you, so some titles I think are faring well because of that. Other titles are not. And I think that inevitably we will see some sort of consolidation. We'll probably see fewer titles eventually. So I think overall I would say probably less optimistic, but that doesn't mean I'm not optimistic about magazines. I still love the fact that in many cases, carrying a premium magazine in some markets is a demonstration of brand, right? I won't say which magazines, but why would you, in some markets, you want to be seen to be carrying it and reading it. You can't be seen to be reading it and carrying it if it's on your tablet, right? So depending on consumers' view of brands will depend on how they deal with the physical product. Some newspaper brands are very powerful. Some newspaper brands are very powerful. And so therefore I think there is an opportunity not just say everything moves digital for a sort of print to exist and do quite well. So slightly less optimistic, but not pessimistic about magazines.
We had a lady here with a question.
Deborah Bothan, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and your partner.
Depends
So
what
I'm
you
gonna-
say.
I'm going to ask you a tough one. Just from your global perspective, you mentioned the fact that in general, you don't think that media brands are connecting with the consumer. So we've gotten almost an hour into this and no one said the word data yet, right? And so my question is, are you familiar with any organizations around the world, and it'd be interesting to hear outside the US, that are doing something to really leverage the consumer data to make a difference with their experience?
So I'll think about that. Yes, we haven't mentioned data. And by the way, it was us as consumers that said we weren't being. I didn't say that. Everyone here said it, including you. Is there other organizations? Okay, so the first thing I will say is I'm wondering whether you said media organizations. So one of the interesting things these days is around, first of all, what is a media organization? Right? So defining that little box. And then defining, adjacencies to the media business. And I think that there are organizations who are beginning to use, that consumers are telling me, something's happened, right? I am actually receiving stuff that I want, and I didn't know how I'm receiving it, but I'm now receiving stuff I want. And that's a combination of retail brands, that's including media brands. So I would say it is happening. I think the flip side of that is that when it does happen, not everyone wants it, right? So we're also hearing a bit of this backlash, which says, you know what? I just got addressed. We interviewed someone in the street once, and he says, I keep getting these messages that describe me as hi Phil. And he says, only my friends call me Phil. So how do they know to call me Phil? And that's a bit scary. Now, he will have been called Phil because someone has been mining data and has been that's how he's being addressed. So I think the answer to your question, Deborah, is yes, we are seeing it, but I think it's a collaboration between media companies and others.
And there's a risk in there if people find it too scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, and that's why I think that the true relationship, building the true relationship between the media company and the consumer is what we're really talking about.
Right.
And that's around, so to me, forging trust is really important. So how do we forge trust between, a media company and the consumer? That is pretty critical because mining data doesn't necessarily forge trust.
No, it doesn't. Well, I think we're out of time. It's being signal over there. Marcel, thank you very much.
Thank you.